Stephen Mulkey is currently a professor at the University of Florida, where he teaches about climate change to mainly undergraduates. Prior to his appointment there, he's had a long and distinguished teaching and research career at a number of other universities. But perhaps most interesting to me, he was president of Unity College for 4 years, I think. And while he was at Unity College, he led the movement to make sustainability science the framework of all academic majors. And to my mind, that's a remarkable achievement that has not been duplicated at very many universities. So, Stephen also has a wonderful blog that he does called The Environmental Century. And I think it's environmentalcentury.com. But he's one of the scientists who sees it as an obligation to educate the public in terms that the public understands. And again, I think that's an extremely important service that he provides, that academic research that only leads to more academic research is of somewhat limited value. So it's that important role of translating it and bringing it to the public that is so important. So Stephen, tell us where we are and which direction we're heading and what we can do.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and I will take us through this very quickly. I'm going to share my screen, and let me know if you cannot see my screen.
We can see it.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be a bit of a realist, and I'm going to talk about the false summit of climate change progress. We've all had the experience of climbing a mountain or climbing a steep hill and realizing that we've encountered a false summit, and that the real summit is still beyond where we thought we were reaching the top. There's been a lot of positive movement at Glasgow and a lot of discussion about how great things are and how we're gonna get this under control. But I think we're falling very far short of where we need to be. So Robert Watson stated something about geoengineering, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that. I teach geoengineering in considerable detail. He says relying on untested carbon dioxide removal mechanisms to achieve the Paris targets when we have the technologies to transition away from fossil fuels today is plain wrong and foolhardy. Why are we willing to gamble with the lives of millions of people and the beautiful life around us and the futures of our children? CO2 removal is something that really has never worked, and yet we're betting the future on our ability to pull CO2 out of the air through technological means. Very, very risky because the technology has not been adequately developed. This gives you a sense of where we are over the last 2,000 years. The Berkeley Earth temperature analysis puts us at 1.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. The IPCC in the AR6, the sixth assessment report, says it's 1.1. And here's the data that have come out of that sixth assessment report. Temperatures over land have increased faster than over the oceans on the global average. And this is the trajectory of the overall Earth temperature according to the various groups that have been analyzing the temperature. There are many more besides these, but you can see the Berkeley Earth here, as well as NOAA and the UK Hadley Center. It's getting hotter and weather's becoming more extreme. Air temperatures are increasing faster over land than over the ocean. The global mean increase relative to pre-industrial is 1.1 according to the IPCC. The Berkeley Earth estimate is 1.3. Every decade since 1980 was the warmest decade on record at the time. So where's all the energy going? Well, it's going into the oceans. And you can see the superficial parts of the ocean are absorbing most of the energy, but it's now starting to be very significant down at depth. 90% of the energy imbalance is absorbed by the oceans. The ocean heat content is 30% greater than estimated in 2014. This came as a real shock to people, scientists. Warming is now substantial to a depth of 3,000 meters, and this heat is transforming the major ocean currents and causing the atmosphere to warm faster. So there's an acceleration of warming underway as the heat content of the oceans goes up. If you look at the emissions of the three primary non-condensing greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, since the dawn of the industrial period, they have gone exponential. This comes from ice cores in Antarctica over the last 2,000 years. Regions and countries have warmed more than that 1.1 and the Berkeley Earth estimate of 1.3. And this is the Berkeley Earth's estimate of how much it's warmed in the United States. As a country, we have already warmed 1.7 degrees in 2020. And they argue that with the current policies in place after the Paris Agreement, we're headed toward 4.3. There are a number of groups that disagree with this and think that we've effectively avoided this. I'm not one of them. I think that this is still very possible. One of the things about hotter air is that it can absorb more water from the land and cause more drought, and it forms torrential downpours and can cause more floods. So floods and droughts are the flip side of the same coin. A large increase of flood and drought risk is projected toward the end of the century, and this analysis uses medium-high emission scenario that are consistent with the current policies without the pledges, and we'll talk about the difference between those two. Our food security is at grave risk. A frequency of a once-in-a-decade crop drought event. If we take the historical as a once-in-a-decade normalization, and this now happens 1.7 times a decade. At 1.5, it'll be twice. At 2 degrees, it'll be 2.4. And if we do realize 4 degrees, it'll be 4.1. This represents an increase of risk of between 40% to 60% for the United Kingdom in particular. So Greenland passed a tipping point in 1997 where the annual refreeze was outpaced by the annual number of melt days. And this figure tells the story in its entirety, really. 1972 to 1980, there was still a lot of ice untouched on Greenland. And now the entire ice sheet and the glaciers along the coast are in fact melting at an incredible rate. So this leads to more sea level rise. In the previous assessment report, it was 3.2 millimeters per year, fueled by meltwater from Greenland and thermal expansion. Seas are now rising 4.4 to 4.8 millimeters per year, and the rate will accelerate over coming decades. The sixth assessment report is from models with major assumptions, and this is their language. There is deep uncertainty about how fast Greenland and Antarctica will melt. This shows you the trajectory of the rate of sea level rise. The rate is accelerating, and for the Florida Atlantic coast, the experts that I interact with are talking about 1 to 2 meters by 2100. And a recent publication, the Proceedings of the National Academy, argued that 1.8 meters is prudent for planning purposes. So US wildfire since 1973 has increased dramatically for many regions of the West, especially the central part of California. It's more than 200% higher. There is a fuel load problem, but climate change is the primary driver. And this is an example of the wildfire smoke that was generated in July of 2021. This is a major public health hazard throughout the continental United States and up into Canada. And there's been increasing attention of on the linkages between climate change and public health. I teach an entire course on that at the University of Florida. One of the things that gets people in Florida's attention is hurricanes. and the monster storms are growing more common. The question we ask about an event is not whether or not the event was caused by climate change, but what features can we attribute to climate change? And for hurricanes, they're stronger because of much hotter oceans. Category 4 and 5 are becoming more common. The oceans are, in fact, in some regions hotter than they've been in likely 3 million years. Hurricanes are becoming more frequent, and this will get worse. Slower because of reduced temperature gradient between the North Pole and the equator reduces the driving force that moves hurricanes over the ocean. They're wetter because they take up more water moving slowly over a very hot ocean. They intensify more quickly in the Northern Caribbean and the US Atlantic coast because the wind shear is actually reduced and hurricanes retain power further inland, and they carry much more water and rain into further inland regions. So the damage being done by hurricanes is significantly more severe than it was even a decade ago. So I'd like to put this all in prehistorical context. If we go back to the last glacial maximum of 20,000 years ago, we see that the glaciers receded, melt was underway, and then we hit a plateau. This is known as the Goldilocks climate, not too hot, not too cold. This is the Holocene. It's the most stable interglacial period ever in the last 1.3 million years. All of civilization and agriculture developed during this incredibly stable period. We have left that stable period. The concentrations of CO2 are higher now than 3 to 4 million years since the Pliocene. The rate of CO2 release is unprecedented in 66 million years. Ocean acidity has increased 23 to 26%. The rate of acidification is 10 times faster than any such event in the oceans for over 55 million years, and quite likely since the Permian extinction over 250 million years. To stay below 1.5 by 2050, we must leave in the ground 58% of the oil, 59% of the fossil methane gas, and 89% of the coal. You can see the various countries and how they're affected by these percentages. We are currently at 1.2 or 1.3 or 1.1, depending on who you listen to. And the pre-Paris policies would have taken us well beyond 4 degrees Celsius. Let me be very clear, 4 degrees Celsius will end civilization. And there's no need to mince words about that. 3 degrees will be catastrophic for ecosystems and for human beings and for our food supply. And this is the current policies. Many of them have not been delivered, and some of them have not even been started yet. So the pledge policies have come in later, and if the current policies and the pledge policies are both realized, we'll hit 2.1 to 2.5, somewhat better. But if we're going to stay below 1.5, we will need negative emissions after 2070, which means drawdown of the CO2 concentration in the air. And we don't have a clear idea of how to do that. Let me put it in very clear language. The United Nations does not have a cogent, compelling plan for saving civilization and for feeding the world. So Bill McKibben put it beautifully. He says, winning slowly is the same as losing. On any meaningful human timescale, the climate of the 20th century is gone forever. Return to those so-called normal climate conditions during my lifetime through natural processes will require thousands of years at a minimum. Climate change is being amplified through massive releases of carbon to the atmosphere from living systems. This is not being balanced adequately by uptake of carbon from the land. Current efforts to measure and manage these positive feedbacks are trivial. Without major change, the disruptions to the Earth system will accelerate over the coming decades. And here's a point I want to make to all the young people and everybody who's listening. You have experienced the most stable climate you will ever experience in your lifetime. It will get worse. So what matters most to humans about climate change is the disruption of the biosphere and the impacts on living systems and ecosystem services that support civilization and result in that trophic theory of of money that Brian just told us about. Mitigation and adaptation on a global scale must become the primary work of humanity. Failure to stabilize the Earth system will at minimum massively cripple civilization and possibly end it. So let's have another meeting. And that's what's happening in Glasgow right now, the COP26. You can see the previous COPs have had no impact. Unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gases, limiting global warming to 1.5 will soon be beyond reach. I've added the word soon. This is one of the lead authors of the assessment report number 6. Antonio Guterres, on the 21st of September, the Secretary General of the United Nations said countries are light years away from reaching our targets. We're on the edge of an abyss and moving in the wrong direction. Our world has never been more threatened or more divided. So who's responsible and who's paying? Well, the answer is very simple. Most of the emissions accumulated in the air, which is the only thing that drives the radiative imbalance of the planet. Your rate of emissions doesn't matter. What matters is what's up there, and the United States put most of it up there. The other thing is that fossil fuels have benefited either directly or implicitly in 2020 to the tune of $5.9 trillion in terms of subsidies. These have to be ended immediately. If you're young, my question to you is, why aren't you furious? So intergenerational inequities and exposure to climate extremes are very clear in this graph. The current pledges are the red, 2 degrees is orange, and 1.5 is yellow. The life expectancy of my cohort, actually I was born in 1953, most of my life I have experienced that Goldilocks climate to 1 degree or another. Your life expectancy, if you were born in 2020, will take you into unprecedented changes in the climate and the Earth system. If we stay at 1.5, you will experience your lifetime heat wave exposure by a factor of 4 higher than I have. You will, if it's 2 degrees, it's 6 times, and under the current pledges, it will be 7 times. Well, they polled 10,000 young people from a variety of countries, ages 16 to 25. And they determined that over 50% are moderately worried or extremely worried. Climate change makes me feel sad, afraid, anxious, angry, powerless. All those make sense to me. But if you're in the 2020 cohort, you've been alive a nanosecond. And my generation is responsible for this. This happened on our watch. And so you don't really have any reason to feel guilty. We're the ones that should feel incredibly guilty and offer our abject apologies and all the resources that we can bring to bear to help you. So young people say adults are lying about the impact of their actions. This is in press for The Lancet. Failing young people, dismissing their distress, betraying me and future generations. Are adults acting according to science? We don't think so. Protecting me and the planet, future generations? No. Can be trusted? No. Doing enough to prevent climate change? Absolutely not. So change everything now. Climate change is an intersectional issue. It affects culture, it affects equity, it affects climate justice, it affects minorities, it affects gender inequities. All of these things matter. These are scenes from the previous global climate march earlier this year. It made the front page of most of the major newspapers in the world. It was celebrated, and the exercise of those protests was seen in all countries around the world to one extent or another. A lot of people of color and of different religious backgrounds participated. And you can see that it's justice and jobs that are on people's mind, as well as the climate. So these intersectional issues are at the heart of how we got here. And if you'd like to hear any more from me or ask me any questions, I'm Mulkey at ufl.edu. It's been a privilege to be here. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much. It is so profoundly disturbing and powerful. Um, I looked at some of the um, chat as you were talking, and one young person says she's furious, and other people have talked about that. I just I want to actually throw it open to comments or questions from the people who are still on. I can't thank you enough for that very clear and disturbing presentation. Michelle, is there some way that you can see who has comments or questions?
Yeah, there's one here from David Spence. He says, in Ministry for Future, the heat wave that hit India killed
20
20
million.
million.
20 million. I thought that looked like that. People here in the USA, we don't focus on such a killer heat wave. Are we putting our heads in the sand?
Absolutely, no question about it. India is one of the hotbeds, no pun intended, of climate warming. Presently, India exports more food than it consumes domestically, although the distribution and abundance of that food within India varies greatly. There are hungry people in India, but it actually makes more food than it needs presently. But that is a very temporary situation. And the potential for exactly the kind of heat wave that happened in Ministry for the Future is very, very real and likely to occur sometime before 2030 or early in the 2030s. So I fully expect it to be that to be a very real scenario. And all of the political fallout that would come from that would be massive.
Stephen, there's another question here from Sandra. What do you want to say to economists?
I saw a tweet today. What's your most phony science? In, assuming you start with economics. So the thing that I want to say to economists is that the circular economy is a fairy tale, and that the work that Brian is doing is absolutely essential to our understanding of what real economy is. Also, work that's been done by Oxfam is also critical to understanding that the larger picture has to do with social well-being, education, the social foundation, not just exceeding the planetary boundaries. And economics typically does not include that. Economists are very enamored of their circular models of supply and demand and cash flow and rents. And I teach a module on this in all of my courses. And one of the things that is happening is that graduate students in schools of economics are revolting now. They're saying, no, this has to stop because it's absolutely unrealistic.
Marcus, do we have time for a couple more questions? A couple more have come in that look good.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we have time, and I have a question, but I might hold off on my question, but go ahead, do the
Okay,
others.
so here's the first one from David McCain. Given the situation you've laid out and lack of progress in reducing emissions, do you suggest we put our energy into adapting to the drastic changes or trying to mitigate emissions, or some of both?
We absolutely have to do both. I teach a course to the freshmen called Communities in Climate Change. Out of my fully enrolled course earlier this week, only 2 of them knew who David Attenborough was. I had to teach them that. So it was a real generational difference. But the community is the front line of adaptation. And we need to pull together as communities. We need to look at things like co-housing. The climate emergency plans that communities have put together have all focused on emissions. I disagree with that. For small and medium-sized communities, they should be focusing on things like food security, water security, preparation, disaster preparedness, disaster reduction plans. and energy security should come somewhat down the line. So the communities need to get their priorities right because they're going to have to feed themselves. And we need to understand where our food supply comes from, what the supply chain issues are, what the supply chain carbon issues are. Now, that said, nationally and state policies, we absolutely have to have strenuous, unprecedented, massive, immediate efforts at mitigation. So these are things that have to be mandated. They, in my opinion, the free market economy is not going to get us there. It has to come through legislation, and the United States is light years away from having such legislation. Although Biden can do some things by executive order, if the Build Back Better plan does not get through Congress through reconciliation, we're stuck. Because so much of that plan is necessary, and it's very serious. It's serious, it's big, it can be effective. Half a trillion dollars in that plan is devoted to climate change mitigation and adaptation, which is unprecedented in the history of this country. It's not enough, but it's far, far better than anything we've had in the past.
Great. Are you up for some more questions? There's a
Sure.
few coming in.
Sure.
This is from Krista Sadler. How does the rise in nationalism throughout the world affect our ability to mitigate climate change or adapt to it?
I think it is one of the greatest threats that we could consider, the political scenarios that are emerging, and especially the incredible threat to democracy in the United States. Perhaps you've read about how the state of Florida has prohibited faculty at the University of Florida from testifying in lawsuits against the state on its voter restriction laws, which have now become quite severe. That's a clear violation of academic freedom. It's just one of thousands of examples. In life in a red state, it's very, very challenging. In 2007, I was science advisor to Charlie Crist, the governor of Florida, and his Century Commission for a Sustainable Florida. My gig was climate change and energy alternatives. In March, I was giving an invited talk to a joint committee of the House and Senate. About 2 minutes into my talk, a senator rose from his seat, called me a liar and a charlatan, and demanded that I be dismissed, and I was. So the good news is I finished my talk on time. The bad news is that nobody heard the science. And that is very typical of the type of repression that's going to happen moving forward. I'll be blatantly partisan here, and I'll say that the GOP has no interest in furthering the initiatives that are necessary to save our young generations and the future for our kids and grandkids and beyond. We absolutely have to do everything we can in all of these countries to salvage our democracies and to make sure that they are effective. I think we're in for a very difficult period. And as resources get tighter and heat waves get more severe, droughts get worse, flooding gets worse, all of the things that we can expect, multiple breadbasket failures around the world have already occurred, and they're going to get worse. The adaptation of our crop varieties is not adequate at this point. We need massive research efforts to make crop varieties that can be used as adaptation to the future climates that we're facing. We're not anywhere remotely near that yet. The bottom line is life is going to get difficult. It's going to be a bumpy ride moving forward. And unfortunately, historically, this is exactly the conditions under which nationalism can take root and grow.
There's a
I
lot
do
more
think,
questions, but go ahead, Marcus.
no, this is, it's so important to hear what you have to say and to learn from your experience. It clearly, I think we need to bring this conversation to an end, just time ways. But again, I can't thank you enough for
Art, can I
work
just
that you're-
interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
Actually, Brian would like to address one of the comments as well before you
Oh, good.
close things down.
Yeah, thank you so much. I took a picture of, someone commented, and yeah, mostly this doesn't help those of us who aren't economists. We need to know what the conclusion is for climate change. All right, so, and that was a response to my talk, and I just want to make sure that it was crystal clear. The main point of that whole thing was growth is the wrong goal. And, you know, we had decades to recognize this with the limits to growth coming out in 1973 and, you know, prior books like Silent Spring a decade earlier, giving us the red flags about the push for GDP growth. You know, Stephen's talk, we need that all over the place now. But just think, we wouldn't have needed that if we had gotten a clue about the stupidity of economic growth as it began to cause more and more problems than it solved. So that was the point. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Brian.
I do see that Dave McCain has put, and Katie has put out a message that we keep this going a bit longer. And I'm wondering if people, shall we give ourselves 10 more minutes to answer some of those questions and then go from there?
I'm happy to stick around.
Great.
Great.
If you
Thank
need
you.
to, if you need to go, of course we understand, and thanks for joining us. But why don't we give ourselves just a few more minutes? It's you know, it is hard to digest what we've just heard. So Michelle, you want to keep moderating those questions?
Sure. There are some really good ones in here. I'm just going in order of how they were posted. Leah asks, while we can't rely on carbon sequestration to solve the climate crisis, do you believe it's valuable to invest in pursuing it?
I have major qualms about that. Presently, all of the schemes for drawdown using technological means will extend the lifetime of the fossil fuel industry. Two major schemes are the unstated goals of the fossil fuel industry in carbon capture and sequestration. One is to use that carbon capture to produce synthetic liquid fuels based on carbon, which would then be used for our transportation fleet and other things that we use liquid fossil fuels for. They're arguing that this is net zero. It's nonsense because of all of the fossil fuels necessary to create those syn fuels. The other thing that they're absolutely planning on, all of the big oil companies are planning on capturing the CO2 at the smokestacks or direct air capture from the air. And let me remind you that CO2 is a rare gas, 0.04%. It takes a lot of effort to capture CO2 out of the air and a lot of energy. The thing they're planning on is capturing that CO2, compressing it and injecting it deep into the wells that are no longer producing so they can realize what's known as enhanced oil recovery. And of course, their plans are to sell that so it can be burned in the standard economy. So the insanity of that is obvious when you state it that clearly. The other thing to say about carbon capture and sequestration and direct air capture is scaling it in time and space would be a monumental effort. It would take enormous amounts of raw materials, steel, which presently would have to be made with fossil fuels, creating enough of these devices fast enough to make a difference in the current climate situation in this century is hard to imagine. And the US National Academy, when in the two big reviews that it's done of technology-based carbon capture and sequestration, it basically has concluded, A, this stuff is not ready for prime time, and two, it will not scale. It will take enormous numbers of these facilities around the world, and we don't have the time to create them. So I don't think we should invest in it at all. I think we need legions of eco-managers to rebuild our forest and ecosystems with the attention toward management of species and biodiversity, toward carbon capture through nature's mechanisms. And the other thing that is so obvious, and I just can't believe that it's not being talked about so clearly as it needs to be, is we got to kill the fossil fuel industry right now. We got to kill it. And if you listen to the work of Mark Jacobson and others, there is no doubt that we have the renewable means and ability to deploy so that we can very quickly wean ourselves from fossil fuels. So if we do those two things, like capitalize on nature's own mechanisms and manage them aggressively with like the work projects administration under FDR, imagine all of the people we could put to work taking care of ecosystems around the world so that we maximize our carbon sequestration. Yes, eventually it does get released back to the atmosphere, but it's not a zero-sum game. You can always maintain more carbon in the ground from natural sources than you're losing. And so there's a lot of work to be done. We need to rejuvenate our oceans for exactly the same reasons. And at the same time, we absolutely have to kill without mercy the fossil fuel industry. And I believe those two things would get us where we need to go.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Another question for you. This is from Stefan. Where does human population growth fit into all of this?
Well, population growth is mainly a matter of resource use. So there's a myth out there that if you have one fewer child, it's going to have a huge carbon benefit. Well, this is only true in highly developed nations like the United States. One fewer child in India and Africa is not going to have much of a carbon impact. So the argument that population needs to be controlled in those countries and that's the problem is not only absurd, it's deeply insulting to people that intellectually understand what population growth is and to the people that actually live in those countries. If we're going to control population, then we need to do it in the developed countries, and we need to make it national policies to accept the millions of climate migrants that are going to occur. So we don't have to worry about where our workforce is going to come from if we will accept those migrants across our borders and to make them welcome and help them find a home. Angela Merkel did a beautiful job of this, accepting 1 million refugees into Germany and dispersing them throughout communities around Germany. And it was a huge success. There's no reason why the United States couldn't do something similar, or the UK, or any number of other developed nations, if they would use the right means and manage the influx and redistribution of those migrants into their countries. So I don't agree that population growth is the issue. I think it's consumption that is the issue. And the developed nations, we consume, well, let me put it very clearly. The per capita consumption of goods and services in the United States is the highest in the world by a large measure. We are also per capita the greatest emissions source in the world, if you discount Saudi Arabia, which uses methane to air condition entire outdoor streets. And it's a very small population. The United States is 350 million plus, and every one of us has a huge carbon footprint. And the fossil fuel industry wants us to believe that it's our job to reduce our carbon footprint. Well, I don't think that we should shirk our individual responsibilities to do everything we can, but they're trying to convince us that the emissions that they have created are our responsibility because we consume it. that's also intellectually insulting and patently false. They own the responsibility for this, and we need to hold them accountable. The executives of the fossil fuel companies, the petroleum industry that appeared before Congress recently, basically took the line that of all the denial and delay tactics, the op-eds that they had written, the advertisements that they had placed, they basically said, we didn't do that. We would never deny climate change. It was a bald-faced lie. And one of the executives actually said, we're not subsidized, we pay taxes. Also a bald-faced lie. So you've got to realize who these people are. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put it bluntly, some of us have to live with the world that you are setting on fire. And if you could see the faces of these executives when she said that, it was obviously for a couple of them that it was absolutely the first time they'd ever had that thought. They live in a fantasy land, and they're taking us all down the drain with them.
I think Brian wants to jump in on this one too.
And Michelle, I can't type in the chat, but I have a question I want to pose. So, but
Yeah.
Brian first.
Well, to that population issue, we absolutely have to stabilize population. I mean, the real issue is GDP, population times per capita consumption.
I
And
agree.
Stephen's right. In
Right.
the USA and a lot of the developed countries, it is the per capita consumption that's the rampant problem. And in other parts of the world, it's the population that's the bigger problem. And that's why you have immigration pressures. People want to go to a place with higher per capita consumption futures. So, you know, we have what we consider to be the smart strategy, the smart diplomacy for dealing with immigration in the USA. We say, yeah, but borders need to be tightened, but only when the USA says, you know what, we are no longer on the growth path. We recognize that it's tearing the planet apart, the growth of the global economy, starting with this rich one. And so we're going to undertake the transition to a steady state economy. Then you have to, as part of that, stabilize population. And that it does include getting a handle on immigration. I mean, population is, you know, a matter of the domestic and the international flow. So you have to do that. But also at the same time, then you take some of the economic surplus and help in those parts of the world where they, in most cases, people don't want to leave except for, you know, the fact that they're desperate because of the awful conditions there. But if you help in those areas to improve those conditions, then all of a sudden you have a logical, an ethical, and a safe, a much better approach to national security and international stability. So one last thing about that, you know, we like to use the metaphor of the 800-pound gorilla. Nobody wants to talk about economic growth as the problem. Like Greta Thunberg said, you know, there's these fairy tales of perpetual economic growth. But that's the problem for just about all environmental problems, and definitely with climate change. So the 800-pound gorilla's got two arms, population and per capita consumption.
I agree. The world population needs to stabilize. There's no question about that. You know, I just take some issue with people that will throw that out as the solution to the entire problem. It's not.
Stephen, my question has to do with higher education, that, you know, what you're doing in your classes is fantastic, and other people are doing similar work in other places. But the presidents of, I assume, the University of Florida, but Harvard, Stanford, go right down the list, they probably know most of that science that you presented to us. They probably know that we cannot maintain a fossil fuel industry. they know all this stuff, and yet they continue to operate within the system, more or less. That most of the students go off to study economics, to study business, to study nursing or something,
Yeah,
and
they do.
their goal is to have a lifestyle that is on par or slightly better than their parents, which requires a growing economy. And so our universities overall um, kind of perpetuate that notion that we can grow our way out of this, that we can engineer our way out of it, that it's manageable. What do you say to these institutions, not to individual faculty, but to these institutions about their role of informing all of us of this moment in history?
I think most of them are shirking their responsibilities, and they have for at least 20 years. I imagine that some of these presidents have been administrators for so long that they simply don't have a clue of this science. They don't really listen to it. They really don't know about it. I agreed to become president of a failing small college, an environmental college, because I saw it as an opportunity to make major changes when the buck absolutely stopped on my desk. And as such, we became the first college in the nation to divest our endowment from the top 200 fossil fuel companies. And that was the kickoff for the Do the Math tour with Bill McKibben. Bill was a great friend to Unity College, and he always gives us credit whenever he talks about divestment. The astonishing thing today is that the total amount of money under divestment that's in progress being divested from fossil fuels is approaching $40 trillion. This is more than the GDP of China and the United States combined. So there's undoubtedly going to be some serious fallout for the fossil fuel industry because of that. There's no question that money for fossil fuels is getting tighter and tighter. The big banks are making statements along the lines of, by such and such a date, we will no longer fund fossil fuel enterprises. The presidents of these universities have bought into the fairy tale themselves of endless economic growth. And in part, that's because of their constituencies. There's a couple of things to realize about higher education. One, a private college, the fiduciary is the board of trustees. They are ultimately responsible for not just the financial well-being of the institution and can be held legally liable for it. They are also responsible for its ethical and moral construct. That's what the word fiduciary actually means. The state and public institutions, the real fiduciary is the governor and the legislature. And that's been illustrated very clearly in the state of Florida, where the governor is now controlling the free speech and academic freedom of the faculty in the state university system. So they are completely wedded to the standard economic growth, even though that is in fact a fairy tale. When I was president, I went to a lot of meetings with other presidents from around the country, initially mainly hoping that they would teach me a little bit about how to be a good president. What I discovered is at these meetings where the presidents were only allowed to attend with their spouses was that the major topic of discussion was their monetary compensation, their retirement packages, their insurance, not how to make a better higher education system. I left those meetings with a much lower level of respect for academic administrators than I went there with. And I now have no illusions that they are working for the betterment of the students and the betterment of civilization. The mission of higher education is the maintenance and renewal of civilization. It is morally reprehensible to simultaneously invest in its destruction.
Oh, I think that's a brilliant note to end on. Thank you so much.